we decided to do an interview with Megan. Megan is the latest investor in Pendo. She's a general partner at Spark Capital, and I am going to ask her a bunch of questions, and hopefully not surprise her too much. And
this is retribution for when I asked you a bunch of questions.
Yeah, it's true. She asked me a ton of questions. Exactly. So I'm going to start off and ask a few questions to give you a sense of her background, and then we'll kind of jump in from there. But you started your career as a product manager at Google right out of Stanford, with your first product being the company's IPO. So I don't know if you guys remember back those days. What was that like?
Yeah. Sorry, my mic. So I actually dropped out of Stanford my senior year to go to Google about 6 months before the IPO. I was a political science and history major, not sort of your typical product management background. I'd taken a bunch of computer science, but frankly, I was really bad at it. And went to Google to really be like the lowest woman on the totem pole as it related to our IPO. And specifically, that was working on our roadshow. And at the time, Google wanted to treat the IPO like a product. They wanted to innovate on what it meant to do an IPO. This is a very Googly type thing. And so some of you may recall, they tried to do something called a Dutch auction, which is a different type of IPO that, in theory, enables everyday investors to have an opportunity to invest in a company, not just large banks and institutions. And so we treated the roadshow, we treated our founders letter, we treated even the type of IPO we were doing as this product, and I was scouring around trying to help and make everything work. Subsequently, actually, the Dutch auction didn't work, and that's why you haven't heard of anyone doing it since. But the spirit was there. The spirit was in it. I will say it was a little bit unusual. Google at the time, and still largely today, requires all product leaders to have a technical background. So you have to have majored in computer science or the like and done very well. And given that not only I didn't major in those things and I dropped out, it was a little bit unusual, but it was also a time when, frankly, they just needed like warm bodies to come into the company and make things happen. So that was how I got into it, and I skirted the typical sort of recruiting process that they require.
Wow. So this is not even a question I have, but now I'm just curious. Did you finish your degree?
I did. I had to write 2 papers. So my dad told me I had to drop out. He said, you got this job, you're going to go take this job. And my mother said, you have to finish school. And as a child being put in the middle between those 2 things, I dropped out and wrote 2 papers.
Wow. Well, that's good to know. Very cool. Well, somehow, with that background and working on the IPO, you got into Google Maps.
Yeah.
So how did that happen, and what was that like? I mean, I think everyone in the room has used Google Maps, so tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So shortly after the IPO, we acquired a company called Keyhole, which was the precursor to Google Earth. And I had actually been a historical map collector by personal passion. I think you have an image.
Yeah, let's see the picture here. So.
And I've told Todd my entire house all the walls are covered in my map collection, which I started when I was about 10 years old. I was this weird kid. Christmas, parents would be like, what do you want? And I was always like, maps. And still to this day, I tell my husband, like, if anything happens to the house, like, leave the photos, leave the family mementos, grab the maps, let's get out of here. So we acquired this company called Keyhole, and we started to get really serious about local search and mapping. This was when basically MapQuest was the best in breed, but there was no WYSIWYG, drag and drop experience that we're familiar with, the JavaScript-enabled experience. And I was personally really, really passionate about that from my own collection. So I basically forced my way onto the team, and I started by saying, okay, like, I've done this IPO thing, but I don't know anything about product management. But I know a lot of press and reporters, and I'm good at talking to them. So why don't I just do marketing for you guys for a little bit right after the acquisition? And this gets into why one of the things I think is useful as a product manager. So I did marketing for Google Maps for a period of time. And it's a little bit nerdy, but we were dependent on third-party data providers, Navteq and TeleAtlas. And then Nokia bought Navteq, TomTom bought TeleAtlas. And we wouldn't think of it today, but Nokia was like a real competitor for Google at the time, as someone we actually cared about. And we got very nervous about our access to this data. So we kicked off a project to build our own maps from scratch. And I could geek out for another 35 minutes about what it takes to build a map, but essentially everywhere in the world, standing right here, there's 22 pieces of discrete information that you have to go out and buy in order to build a map. And that also includes, by the way, putting cars on the road, which isn't there just to give you pretty street-level imagery, but is actually used to collect data about the world. And so I kicked off this project internally based on being loud and passionate with a technical colleague, Sebastian Thrun, who's subsequently gone on and started Udacity, another startup in the education space. And I started doing biz dev. So I started going out and helping acquire all these data types that we were going to need. So 22 different pieces of data per location, magnified that by, we were targeting 144 countries. This was going to be a long-term effort. So I was building a team, moving around the world, doing BD for a while. So finally, we have the BD deals coming to fruition. We have data coming in. At the same time, the engineering team has been building this tool that sort of overlays the data on top of each other and enables an operations team in India to correct it. But there was no product lead. And so then I said, OK, well, I'm ready to be the product person because no one knows as much about this as I do now that I've done the marketing and I've done the data acquisition. And by the way, I've been doing specs for the engineering team all along. And so that is a very long story of how I ended up being the product lead for Google Maps, specifically this effort to build our own map.
Wow.
And
That's an
ended up doing
amazing story. Yeah, I mean, it's a good story about how one domain knowledge is one of the key aspects of becoming a product manager. And I just must say, I mean, I looked at your living room and I realized that I need to do a lot more work. So I think my wife would want more control over how things look.
It's easier when you don't have children.
Probably.
Everything stays
I decided not to show that picture to my wife, thinking that may cause more stress for me than anything else. So you got this domain knowledge, you became a product manager. I mean, obviously Google Maps is an amazing run, really successful. And then you make a move to Square. And tell us about why you did that. So you left your passion of maps. Maybe you have a secondary passion around key fobs or little fobs that we don't. Transactions. Yeah, I guess we all have excitement, passion around that. So.
Yeah, I mean, when I left Google Maps, it still is today the second largest Google property after Google.com, and it was quite an accomplishment that we had sort of built our own and flipped on one day. I mean, everyone in product management has had that experience where everybody's sitting by the computer and you're about to push go and it's like, is this going to work? And my boss came over to me and he said, success has many fathers, but failure just one. And I was like, great. And then I had it made into a t-shirt, which I gave him, and he still has. It's actually John Hankey, the founder of Niantic, which is the guy behind Pokemon Go. So there's all sorts of interweaving stories. But I started having these reoccurring nightmares after 8 years that I would wake up and I was 60 years old and I was like senior vice president of some product group at Google and I'd never left. So I forced myself. It's like, okay, I'm going to have to go and do something else. Because remember, I'd come out of college. So in a lot of ways, Google for me was an extension of college. I dated my colleagues, like stuff you shouldn't do. We ate all of our meals there. They did my laundry. It was, that was Google at the time. It's much more financially rigorous now. So I started to talk to a couple other companies and met Jack Dorsey during this period. And Jack wasn't, at the time, he wasn't the Jack he is today, which was he had already been one of the co-founders of Twitter, but he'd also been kicked out, frankly. And so he was working on his next thing, and this was kind of the comeback kid story. And he had this idea around mobile payments and specifically this dongle, which he had started building. He would hate it if he knew I called it a dongle. The Square card reader, TM. We met, and he was like, well, we don't have a product organization. I'm the product organization. But if you know anything about payments companies, the real product of a payments company is actually your risk and fraud engine, because risk and fraud is what enables you to take risks as it associates with lending to the kinds of audience that we were lending to at the time, which was small businesses, individuals, and so forth. So he said, I would like us to build a risk and fraud team that operates like a product team. And so do you think you could do that? Would you be interested? And I was like, sure. And I've always said yes, and this is like sort of one of my mantras is I just say yes when people ask me to do things I don't know how to do. And so I started, and I was the 20th person at Square, and I started, and the very first day, JP Morgan was our underwriter, so we were the merchant of record for all of the Square merchants, but we really looked like one merchant up to JP Morgan Chase, who was giving us the right to extend credit. And I got on the phone and we did this weekly call with them, and it happens to be that we do it every Monday. So Monday afternoon, there's no onboarding, like 20 people at Square or whatever. I get on the call and they're like, well, we need to go through AML readings. And I was like, AML readings? And I'm sitting there on my iPhone. It wasn't even an iPhone maybe, and I was like, AML, AML, AML. And then it's like taking a long time, and then I see it says like, anti-money laundering. And I was like, oh shit, like I am, sorry. Sorry. That was like, I am out of my depths. Like, I don't know what anti-money laundering is. And by the way, I don't know what an anti-money laundering reading is. Which, by the way, it turns out in practice, it's like when you look at the list of transactions, are there ones that stand out that you think are money laundering? You're supposed to dig in on those. I didn't know anything about this. So I was like, yeah, and I'm playing along, and I'm doing that, and so whatever. Like, I get 1 week in, and then on the first week, sorry, I'll be faster, but on the first week, we launched this product. And I hadn't worked on it because I hadn't even been there. And it was great, it was really interesting. And then the next day, it was Friday, we launched it on Thursday. Friday, everyone came back into the office and was like, yeah, so what are we gonna do now? I was like, what do you mean? Well, I mean, what's the next thing on the roadmap? Like, let's go to the queue. And they're like, oh, no, we don't have one. And I was like, so how do we decide what we build? Oh, we get together, we sit in a conference room, we talk about it. I was like, okay. So I went home that weekend, wrote this long email to Jack of like, hey, I know I'm new here, I know I don't know anything, blah, 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 but like, here's a million different things I would do to help really develop an engine around building. And an engine, by that, I usually mean product engineering and design. And no good deed going unpunished. He wrote back and he's like, congratulations, you're the new vice president of product at Square.
Wow, well, that was a good one. Now, Jack is known as a product person. He was running the product. And I hear that working for CEOs that are product people is difficult. I know this, I'm told. What did you find? What are some tips and tricks, and then how did you find where to carve out, kind of your area, but not, kind of, how did you work well with Jack?
Yeah, I mean, this took time. I mean, this is not a perfect science. It was really, really hard, actually, because product means something different everywhere. And at Google, product was very much about being the little CEO, whatever product group team that you were working with. And yes, you did reviews, and Larry and Sergey, and they definitely had opinions, but like it wasn't an hourly or daily check-in of any sort. This was completely different. This vision was Jack's, but not only the vision, the execution, in his mind at least, was his as well. And so we struggled and tried a lot of different things. So one of the biggest challenges that I think VPs of product or any sort of level of product have when the founder is a product thinker, whether they are or they aren't, they think they are, is that they have all of the moral authority around the product. And so a lot of founders, and it's something I recommend, they pace the floor of the companies where they work, and they talk to people and see how they're doing. But they can make a comment like, oh, that's an interesting choice of blue. And then it's like, everything stops. And you could have had 15 different product reviews about the color blue you were going to use, but walking by as the founder and saying like, oh, that's an interesting choice of blue, everybody's thrown off. And so that type of thrash, as we typically call it, is really, really detrimental to an overall building standpoint if you are working with a product founder. So that was the number one thing that we were trying to solve for. And by the way, he had total realization and recognition around this. He wasn't trying to say it wasn't the case. So what we ended up doing, and it works for some companies, it doesn't work for all of them, is that we had a morning stand-up for 30 minutes. From 8 to 8:30 a.m., we would stand at a table together, and anyone could come up and ask anything. And the point of us both being there, and get feedback on things, and the point of us both being there was to really ensure that there was alignment between messaging and an agreement that we weren't sending people in different ways. So that worked for a period of time. Then you get to 450 people, which is where it was when I left, and that doesn't really scale, and by the way, every morning at 8 kind of is a drag. And so we just came up with a calendar and a rhythm around check-ins, and we had a really firm belief around scheduling our days, as we called them. So Mondays was for executive teams, Tuesday was all about product, Wednesday was about marketing and growth, Thursday was about legal, and Friday was about HR and recruiting. And we would spend a solid hour every morning as an entire executive team, going through each of those functions and getting everyone on the same page. And so eventually it was a system of product reviews with the entire executive team that really got that sort of alignment.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, apparently I walked by someone and said I liked some acorn, and it ended up on everyone's T-shirt. So I don't know how that happened, but so you did Square for a while, and now fast forward a little bit more to today. You decided to leave product and operations and move to, I guess the dark side, so to speak. Sometimes we call it, but venture capital. And so what led to that decision? Why did you do that? Let's start with why did you do that?
Yeah. So opportunities in venture capital don't come up very often, and I'm always completely mystified when I meet young people who are like, I've always wanted to be a venture capitalist. I was like, who wakes out of bed when they're 15? Like I wanted to be an astronaut, but like
I think that's people that live in the Bay Area.
No,
those
it's the
they see the
craziest
Teslas
thing.
driving down the street. I want one of those.
No,
Right?
it's the craziest thing. It's like I want to go around writing checks and then worrying about them for a long time. So I actually, they don't come up that often. I was approached. John Doerr had been on my board at Google. Mary Meeker was on my board at Square. They both work at a firm called Kleiner Perkins. And they said, hey, would you like to come join the group here? We happen to have this one slot. These slots come up every 15 years, blah, 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 blah. And what was interesting to me was, in sort of spending some time thinking about that opportunity, is that I had really, truly spent 8 years of my life just thinking about maps, and another bunch of years just thinking about payments, and had never seen any other type of business model, product, entrepreneur. Like, I didn't read TechCrunch, I didn't do anything. Like, I was totally in the bubble of the products that I was working on. And so the opportunity to see across the landscape and really be able to be useful and try to be useful across a lot of different products with a lot of different entrepreneurs was really attractive to me. That being said, I think venture capitalists think they add a lot more value than they do. I've told you that. To set expectations really low. And I fully recognize, with all the folks that I work on, that I don't want to be the grandparent. I don't want to be the person that comes in and says, oh, this is great, just like round the edge here and like do this, and like see you guys later, I'll be back in a month. Like, that's not useful. I've had that venture capitalist on my board. So it's something I think a lot about.
Okay. Yeah. So, what's always scary for me as a product person is, I did not go to Harvard Business School. And right there, that's kind of scary.
We consider that a plus in our investment memo.
Well, it's hard. I'm not a finance person. You're not a you have a political. You just eked out of Stanford. It sounds like.
Yeah, barely.
Wrote a few papers, and then so you don't presumably have a finance background.
No.
And you have a product manager. How did that background, being a product person at two great companies, prepare you to be a venture capitalist, and how are you different than maybe some of the other partners that come out of more traditional backgrounds, finance school, business school? How's that gone?
There's real pluses and minuses. I'll start with the negatives. The negatives is that I fall in love with products. So I'll be like, oh, I love this product. This is amazing. My sister uses this. My parents use it. I can fall in love with products. I'm like very susceptible to that. But not all products are great businesses. And as much as I wish we could just invest in really, really great products, we need to spend time investing in products that actually have an underlying business or business opportunity. So at the start, I remember it was like my first month in at Kleiner Perkins, and someone was doing what now seems totally obvious, but at the time was very revolutionary. It was like multi-video chat. There's like 15 of these every day now, but at the time it was multi-video chat, and I was like, this is so cool. Like, and then you could like change the boxes, and it was just like very well done. And I was like, okay, I got to bring them in for a partner meeting. I've been there for a hot second, like a week. You don't do this. And so I'm getting like John Doerr and Mary Meeker and all these people to sit around a table, and I like pull this guy in, and I'm like, okay, now like will you like present to the team? And they're all like, oh yeah, that's a great product. Well, how are you gonna make money? And the guy's like, oh, we haven't thought about that yet. And I was like, oh man, that's the question I'm supposed to be asking. So I learned very quickly, and they were very kind to me, and they didn't make me feel too bad about that. So that's the negative, is that I am susceptible to falling in love with products. The positive is that I think, in my view, is that I'm able to dream the dream a little bit better. Because I've come from a building and operating side, when someone comes in and pitches a vision for the future that they think should exist, which is a truly humbling experience, and I appreciate that. Like, I'm able to dream that that can actually happen in a way that people who are fundamentally financially driven sometimes can't. And I think the very best companies, or let's call them the most valued, we all have our opinions about Uber and we all have our opinions about Airbnb, but let's call them highly valued. When they were being pitched, they were not being pitched as billions and billions and billions of dollar businesses. They were being pitched as ideas. And so I think that that's an asset. Another piece is that I think, when you're sitting around the table with a bunch of venture capitalists, I always say like my least favorite thing to do is to spend time with other VCs. But when you are, you want to get.
But you're married to one, right? Let's just qualify that. So.
I am married to one, but you want to have a diversity of background. So I actually think it's extremely helpful to have someone who does have a financial background, who is going to help you model out the next 10 years, who's going to do your discounted cash flows for the next 5 years, who's got experience scaling up sales teams and so forth. But I think it's also then useful to have the yin to that yang, which is that you want to have someone who's built organizations that actually make stuff, that has had to deal with the human trials and tribulations of scaling a company, not just the financial ones. So I think that that's a little bit of the diversity that I end up providing, or at least that's been my experience to date on the companies I've invested in.
Got it. So you said you fall in love with products, and now you're looking for great companies as well. So aside from Pendo, people know that you did this investment. What other things are you looking for? What really interests you in the market right now, as far as interesting companies, interesting sectors? I mean, what do you think is really, really hot and exciting?
So we tend to be founder-driven. I mean, that's a nice way of getting out of that question, which I get asked a lot, which is what areas are really interesting to you? And I was like, oh, it's what the founders are driven by. And so we tend to really see where there's a lot of innovation happening from the building experience, not from where we can project that there's necessarily going to be a big market. Right now, we do spend a lot of time on, which there was a great presentation earlier, the consumerization of the enterprise, or making your work products feel like the products you use at home. We have a very, very, very strong thesis around that. We've invested in a company called Trello that recently sold, which was unbelievably like a tool for collaborating in a list format. Some people thought it felt really thin. It was used at companies that are like 500,000 people. I mean, it was like a true enterprise product, even though it looked and felt like a consumer product. We're also significant investors in Slack, which I appreciate you having the Slack group for this, which fell along the same premise. I mean, I think I've told you the Slack story, but I originally am a part of a small product group in San Francisco that beta tests a lot of products. And Stuart had been building this gaming company, but at the same time had built this other collaboration tool while they were building the gaming company in order to build the game itself, and sort of thought like, hey, this thing's taking off, like within our team, everyone's using it, let me put it into the hands of more people. And so I was a beta tester. Turned out Slack is a single player experience. It's like terrible. But if you want to send yourself messages, it works. And so I met up with him, and I was like, this is really cool, this is super interesting. I had always been into like IRC and stuff like that, but it didn't have the same level of functionality for the everyday, I think, consumer and user. And so invested both at Kleiner, and then we invested at Spark. So I'm very, very long in it. And the real thesis around that was, why do we do email anymore? I mean, it's completely replaced email for us at Spark Capital. We actually don't do any email. Everything is done on Slack. And we find that it's a much more fluid, comfortable, conversational experience that mimics how we interact with our own personal friends and family outside of the office.
Awesome. So you are founder-driven, and you evaluate a lot of companies and a lot of management teams. I suspect you see a lot of product leaders. They probably have you meet with the product people, I would suspect, because you're a product person. What do you look for? What do you like? What do you want to see in a product leader you back?
As a founder or at the executive level?
Both.
Okay. So I do interview a lot of VPs of products for both sort of Spark's portfolio, but also our venture team, the earlier stage folks. And what I always start with is, what does product mean to you? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, it's something totally different at every company. And you can have the best, most capable, well-intentioned product person and the best, most capable, well-intentioned company. But if their view on what product is different, the body will reject the organ. And so you can subscribe to the mini CEO. You can subscribe to the Square model, which was much more collaborative. It was called editorial model. It doesn't actually matter which one. You just want to make sure that there's some kind of alignment there before bringing someone in, because it can grind building to a halt. So that's the first thing I look for. Second thing I look for, and this sounds sort of like a cast-off, but it's really not, is intellectual curiosity. I think the very best product people are trying a lot of other different products, that they're constantly trying to learn about the world around them. They're trying to get as many experiences and feedback and different views, because in some way, shape, or form, if it doesn't inform their work that day, it will inform their work sometime down the line. So that's something else I look for. Third is customer or end user empathy. This is what, as you know, but maybe this group doesn't, this is really what pushed us to invest in Pendo. You can get 90% of the way to an investment and you can be super excited, but then you're like, I'm marrying this company. Like, I'm gonna be with this thing for the next 7 to 10 years. Like, I've had husbands that didn't last that long. And what gets you, like what gets you over that last hurdle usually has something to do with customer or end user feedback and love. So we spoke with, I don't know, I'm looking at Alex, my partner in the back, but something like 20 customers. Probably some of you, so thank you in advance for that, in the course of our diligence. And we had not just like, oh, we love it, blah, 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 blah. So we also posed the question, if the company said you could no longer use Pendo, what would you do? And one of the companies, I won't name them, said, like, the guy was like, I'll quit my job. Like, I'll just walk out the door. Another guy that we talked to, we went through this whole 30-minute conversation about like, how did he use Pendo, how much he loved it, blah, blah, blah. And then he's like, at the end, he's like, hey, so one more question for you guys. And we're like, sure. And he's like, well, do you think you can get me a job there? And I was like, I don't know, but if this all works out, like, recruiting will be part of our responsibility too. Another guy at the end asked if he could invest alongside us. I've never had someone in diligence ask if they can put in, $100 into a company that we're putting 20 million into. So we took that customer love really to heart, and that's what got us across the line. So coming back to your original question, things that I look for: what is your view on product? Are you intellectually curious? And do you have true customer empathy or end user love?
Okay. So I know you've told me in the past that one of your favorite interview questions to ask prospective product management candidates is a product that you're impressed with. So I'm going to ask you, give us a few products, or one in particular that you're impressed with, that is not something you've worked on and not an investment. So.
Sure. I'm looking for Shannon Bowman, who's going to be up here after me. Yes, he's waving his hand, because this is a classic Google product manager interview question. So I definitely cribbed it from Marissa. So products I like these days. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to probably 3 or 4 hours a day. When I'm not talking to people, I'm very much in that. There is a new product, a new app out. It's called We Are Not Investors. It's like super early on. It hasn't even raised money, I don't think. It's called 60dB. And it was created by the 13-year veteran of personalization recommendations from Netflix. And so he is trying to apply what he learned at Netflix to podcasting in all forms: short forms, long forms, across all different types. I mean, basically the same sort of content mix that you might see on Netflix. And as someone who both is personally interested in podcasting, but also believes that I think we're seeing a rapid expansion in products and services built around audio, and how much we are going to be interacting audibly with different products and services, whether it's Alexa or AirPods or whatnot. I think he's sitting on a really interesting opportunity to slice and dice content and make recommendations in a way that Netflix was able to do on video. So that's one. Oh man, I got through one.
No, one's good. So I didn't actually prep you for this question, and I know you get this question a lot, but I do think it's really important given the industry, and given as I said, I've got kids, I got 2 daughters, and I think one of my stress points is all the narrative around women in technology, and obviously we have a lot of work to do, and obviously you're an accomplished woman in technology. What advice do you have for women in the room, folks with daughters? I mean, what do we say? What's your advice that you give?
It's a tough question. I get asked some variation of that question quite a bit too, and the reason it's tough is because actually what I say is not specific to women. So it translates across genders, which is that I have had personal success by saying yes to things that are asked of me. And whether or not I felt comfortable, whether or not I had the expertise, frankly, sometimes whether or not I had the interest, like I have been able to have what to date has been at least an interesting career for me by just continuing to say yes when opportunities present themselves. Where that becomes specific to women is that I think, actually it's not just what I think, it's, I mean, research proven, is that women tend to first evaluate their own strengths and capabilities in something before taking it on. And men tend to say, oh no, I can do it, don't worry about it. And so that is the only sort of gender-specific piece of that advice, but that is what has worked for me to date.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.